Do you want to know how to have a successful software and data migration project? Maybe your company's at the point where you need to move to a new software platform. Or maybe you're considering moving to a new platform at some point in the near future. Well, I'm excited because in today's episode, I'm going to be sharing 7 lessons I learned from leading a large software migration project that I'm confident are going to help you achieve success in your migration project. Starting with the first lesson, form a discovery team. The purpose of the discovery team is to investigate the workflow on the new system and be able to compare it to your current system. Some people call this gap analysis. The important point is not to assume that the new software will work the same as your current software. And the reason for that is there's an old programming adage that says there's more than one way to do it. There's more than one way to develop a software platform to get to the same end goal. Most industry software accomplishes a certain end goal, but there are different ways to get there. Now, software developers aren't usually the subject matter experts in the industry. That means they may not think about things the same way that you do if you are a subject matter expert. So the way they get to the final result that you need, whatever task you need the software accomplished, might not be the same way you have it in your mind, and very likely won't be the same way your current software does it. Let's take an everyday example. Let's say you and a chef are both going to make a pizza. The chef is a subject matter expert in preparing food. And unless you're a professional chef, you are not a subject matter expert. So the way you go about making the pizza is going to be very different. The chef may have a different recipe for the sauce, a different recipe for the crust, different techniques for preparing the ingredients to go on the pizza. So in the end, you're hopefully going to have a decent tasting pizza. The way you go about it is going to be very different. In the same way, different developers are going to create software that achieves the same end goal in a different way. The point of the discovery team is to identify these differences in advance. So the workflow on your current system versus the workflow on whatever potential new system you're looking at to move to could be very different. Knowing this ahead of time and planning for it ahead of time is going to save you time and money. It's also going to save you a lot of stress, or at least your users a lot of stress. You don't want to just move to a platform and then find out while you're using it that the workflows are very different. This is going to add a lot of stress on your users. One thing you'll need to keep in mind when you're looking at this new software is whether the software can be modified. Let's say the workflow on your current system is very different than the workflow on the new system, and your users may have a difficult time making the transition. Find out ahead of time if the vendor is willing to or able to modify their platform. If not, figure out if you realistically can have your users adjust their workflow. Now, another thing to keep in mind while your discovery team is investigating the workflow on the new system is not to assume that your users are subject matter experts either. And the reason I say that is because the point of software is to do a lot of things in the background so that we don't have to do them manually. There are pluses to this and there are minuses to this. On the plus side, software that does a lot of work in the background tends to be very user-friendly. On the downside, users can get lazy. Let's say you have a user that works in a particular industry for many years. That user, if the software they've been using for all these years does a lot of stuff in the background, they may forget a lot of the knowledge that they have. Let's just take an everyday example that you and I can relate to. I use tax prep software to do taxes for my business. I use a business version of tax prep software to do those taxes. If I were to switch and use a very basic version to prepare my business taxes, I would have to do a lot of things manually, which means I'd have to fill out a lot of forms and I'd have to know how to fill out those forms. Years ago in school, I took a year of tax law. The problem is, over the years of using tax prep software, I've forgotten most of that. So again, if your users are going to a new platform that does different background processes, they're going to need to know things that maybe they're not used to using on a daily basis. So it's important to find these knowledge gaps ahead of time. Filling those gaps is going to require time, and in any business, that equates to a cost. And remember, your company runs on a business model. You don't want to break that business model. So when you're looking at this new software, you want to keep in mind a couple of things. The first thing is, You can break your business model by significantly increasing the time it takes for your company to deliver products or services. Another way you can break the business model is by increasing the cost of delivering those products and services. So whether on the new system it takes you significantly longer to do the tasks that you're used to doing on your current system, or whether doing tasks on the new system requires you to hire additional help, either of those can lead to a breakdown in your business. So at this point, you want to make a preliminary assessment. Based on the workflow that you've researched, you've done the discovery on the new system, are you at a point where you could say, yes, the new software still looks good, I'm going to give it a green light? Or are you at the point where you find a challenge that you cannot surmount? At that point, you might have to just say, stop, we're not going to move forward with the software, we need to find another platform. Now, once your discovery team has identified any workflow issues, it's time to gain access to the test system. The first thing to ask about the test system is whether it's an exact replica of the production system. You would think it would be, but in many cases it's not, and that's for a variety of reasons. Now, before you gain access to the test system, you'll want to put together a comprehensive test plan. You want to first find out the features that you're used to using on your current system, do they exist on the new system? Secondly, just because a feature exists doesn't mean it actually works on the new system the way you'd expect it to work. Take the example of sending reports. A lot of systems have the ability to schedule and send out reports. You need to ask whether it works the same on the old system as the new system. I was working on a project once we moved to the new system, the new reports were no longer sent from my clients' email addresses, they were sent from the software vendors' email addresses. And that caused all kinds of problems with the recipients. So in developing your test plan, you want to make sure that you're going to test everything completely. Another thing you'll need to keep in mind is to know what can be tested and what can't be tested. For example, if this system interfaces with third-party systems, sometimes those third-party systems can't handle test data. They can only deal with live data. That's often the case with government systems. You want that you test every scenario from beginning all the way to completion. Again, a feature may not work the way you expect it to work, so you need to make sure to walk through that process from the very beginning all the way to the very end. At this point in the discovery process, you're going to need to think about what happens if this new system doesn't meet your needs 100%. If the new system can be modified, if the vendor's willing to or able to modify their platform, you'll need to scope out every task you need them to do to modify the system. It's important to write out each task with a complete description, nailing down every single detail that you need. If you don't do this, I assure you, your project is going to take at least 3 times as long to complete. Why? Well, let's use an example. Let's say the vendor who's modifying their software for you has a 2-week release cycle. So every 2 weeks, they'll do updates to their system. If you don't write out every single detail of the task you need, by the time the task description verbally gets from you to the project manager, to the system architect on the other side, to the developers, think of it like the telephone game. When you play the telephone game, what you say at the very beginning of the game is very different than what comes back at the end of the game. In the same way, you're going to get deliverables from the developers that really don't match what you asked for up front because it really wasn't written down anywhere. So make sure that you are meticulous in writing down the details of those tasks. Now, if the system can't be modified, you have a couple options. You may need to say, we just can't move forward with this platform, and you may need to start over and search for another platform. Alternatively, ask the question, can you use multiple platforms to meet your needs? In other words, could you use this software? Does it take care of most of your needs, but you may just need to supplement that with another platform? Here's a good example, accounting package. Most industry software is really good at accomplishing what it needs to accomplish for that particular industry. However, every business also needs an accounting package. They need to have payables and receivables in order to get paid and to pay out and to keep going. So here's an example that may not be a deal breaker if you have a package that does not have accounting, you may be able to integrate a third-party package. You may be able to interface that with the existing software to take care of what you need. Something to think about. At this point, you need to do a reassessment. Now that you've gone through the workflow, done your gap analysis, figured out whether all the features are there that you need, it's time to again decide whether this is a green light to continue moving forward or whether we need to put a stop to this and move on and try to find a different software that can meet our needs. Once you've made it through that initial discovery, the next thing you need to do is verify access to your data. And this will involve access from your current system to be able to pull the data out, as well as access to the new system to be able to push the data in so you can actually transfer that data. So the question is, how will you extract it from your current system and push it into the new system? There's a few different ways to do this. You may have direct database access. You may be writing SQL queries against the database. In this case, you need to make sure you have the drivers. Are the drivers available? Do you have them? Can you get them? You need to have credentials. You need to have logins that are going to access that database. And for those logins, you'll need to have the right permissions. Now, in your data migration, you're going to have to do some transformation. The best practice is always to do the transformation as far upstream as possible, meaning as close to the source as possible. So you may want to have permissions that allow you to create views so you can shape the data, which will save you time in the transformation process before you're loading it into your new system. You may also have API access. API access is great. And the same thing with the API, you're going to need credentials, you're going to need the right permissions for those credentials, and you may also run into needing to know what protocol is being used for the API if you're going to be doing hand coding. A couple of common protocols are REST or SOAP. Another thing to ask about the API is, do you have access to all of the data? A lot of times, APIs are available, but they don't actually give you access to all the data. Is there documentation available? Is there a schema file that you can look at to understand what data you do have access to? Another way to extract data or to push data is going to be just a straight import export. This could be like a CSV Excel file, XML, JSON. How is this available? It might be available by FTP, email, on demand. These are all things you're gonna have to find out ahead of time because they're going to impact your data migration process as well as how much time it's gonna take. And last but not least, you'll wanna find out, can you automate the integration? And if you're gonna automate the integration, are you gonna go with hand coding or are you gonna use some kind of a tool? And once you've verified you actually have access to the data, it's time to start outlining your data mapping. The reason you'll need to do data mapping is because the old system and the new system will not have the same data model. And in any project that involves data, often 80% of that project is prepping the data, shaping the data, getting it ready to move into whatever system you need to use it in. So you need to figure out who understands the data well enough, because you're going to need that person or those people to help with the data mapping. You may have subject matter experts who are in-house that can help you. On the other hand, you may need to reach out to third parties. This can happen in particular when you're interfacing with government systems that have complicated rules and regulations surrounding their data. Also remember that because this could take as much as 80% of the project to prepare your data and migrate your data, this is going to be a time-intensive task. You need to make sure you take that into account and build it into your project timeline. At this point, you also need to identify which transformations you're going to need. Now, some basic things that typically happen in data transformation are splitting data, joining data together, data type conversions. However, there might also be a situation where you need to create some lookups. For example, let's say your old system or your current system uses the 2-character code abbreviations for states, and the new system uses the full state names. This is a situation where you're going to have to create a lookup to output the data in the correct format. You're going to have to look up what those 2-character code state abbreviations mean and translate those into the full state names. Another common challenge is translating data from a tabular format to a hierarchical format. And this can come into play when, for example, you may be getting data out of database tables, but the new system only accepts an XML input. So you're going to have to take that data and convert it into a hierarchical format before you can push it into the new system. Once you've outlined your data mapping, the next thing it's important to do is to validate those data load methods. Don't assume that the methods work properly. An example, let's take an API. APIs allow us generally to push and pull data. So you may be getting that from your old system, you may be pulling from your old system. You may also be pushing into the new system, but then you may pull from the new system to do some updates and then push it back. You need to be meticulous in figuring out how this API works and how completely it works. Just because fields exist in documentation or in an XML schema file doesn't mean that they actually populate correctly. So you'll need to test this very carefully. You'll also want to evaluate the performance of the API. Simple things like, how long does it take? How long does it take to push a certain amount of data into the new system? Also, you want to find out how long it takes for that data to actually show up in the new system. So let's say it only takes an hour to push the data into the system, but it may actually not show up in the new system for another 24 hours because maybe it gets put in a queue and that queue just gets processed later. Another thing you want to do with an API is assess its stability. Does it have sustained uptime? For example, if you want to push a lot of data and it's going to take half a day, more than a day, is that API stable consistently over that time? Otherwise, it's going to break your upload. Also, if you do run into issues, or if you do run into errors, are those error messages informative? It's going to allow you to quickly get to the bottom of the error, or are they cryptic or obscure and it's going to take you a lot of time? It's going to be more of a needle in a haystack situation. That is going to significantly impact your timeline. You also want to figure out how robust is this API? Does it have any limits on how many records you can push or pull? For example, I've worked with APIs that only allow you to pull or push 500 records at a time. That means you then need to cycle through in order to get all of the records. Also, does it have a limit on concurrent connections? There was a project I was working on once where it was taking a long time to load the data. So I figured it'd be smart to parallel process and run multiple connections at the same time. What ended up happening after those started to spin up is it brought down their entire server. So it's important to know these things ahead of time, again, so you can plan for a timeline, you can plan for how long it's going to take you to get that data into the new system. And you'll want to do the same for any other data access methods. So once you've validated your data access methods, you know how they work, you know their limitations, you're going to need to choose for your migration project, are you going to do a rolling implementation or are you going to do a cutover? Now, a rolling implementation has a few benefits to it. And what I mean by rolling is, for example, let's say you have a large database filled with customer data. A rolling implementation would be migrating a few of those customers over at a time until all of them are finally migrated. The pros, the upside of that is you have a system that's already up and running that you can fall back to. So both systems, both the current system and the new system will be running at the same time. If you ever had to move a customer back or move customer data back, you could continue processing in the system because they're both up. So you have fallback built in. This also mitigates user unfamiliarity. What I mean by that is that users who have to learn a new platform are going to have to scale that learning curve. Allowing them to process some data in the old system and some data in the new system lessens that learning curve and allows them to get their job done a little more quickly than if they had to 100% use the new system. Using a rolling implementation also allows more time for data migration. So again, if you're only moving some customers over a little bit at a time and not all at once, you can slowly and progressively do that data migration until by the end of the project, you're 100% migrated. Now, some of the downsides of a rolling implementation would be that during the transition period, during your migration period, any new staff, any new hires are going to need to be trained on both the old system and the new system. Also, having data in two different systems can complicate reporting. If you have reports pulling from the old system and the new system, if you're sending that to customers, you may need to figure out, or if you're even using it internally, you may need to figure out how you're going to merge that data so you're not having to go back and forth between two different reports. Another thing to keep in mind, another downside of a rolling implementation is that any external integrations, external interfaces with third-party outside systems may not be able to feed two systems at once. They may be able to only point to one or another system. So you're gonna have to figure that out and how you would handle that on your side. Now let's look at a cutover implementation. The upside of a cutover implementation is that you don't have to double train your new hires. So if you're moving instantly from the old system to the new system, your new hires will only need to be trained on the new system, and that's going to save you time and money. It also simplifies reporting. If you suddenly switch to the new system, the old system goes away, and now all your reports are coming out of one system. It also simplifies those external interfaces, those external integrations, with those, especially with those outside systems that can only feed one system at a time. So it eliminates that problem. On the downside, you're going to need to thoroughly test a rollback plan in the case you have a catastrophic failure on the new system. You need to be able to roll back quickly to the old system. Also on the downside, in order to do a cutover, you're going to need to have some downtime. You're going to need to have a downtime window where no one is able to use either system, because if they're both running at the same time, you may have a transaction that gets orphaned or corrupted between the two systems. So again, you'll need to have a downtime window where neither system will be accessible. Once you've chosen your implementation, this is the point where you're ready to start your project. And if you haven't already, you're going to want to appoint a project lead. And in my opinion, you're going to want a single lead as opposed to having a team lead the project. There will be team members involved. There will be teams of people working in different aspects of the project. You're going to want to have a single project lead. And the main role this person needs to fulfill is to coordinate and align priorities. Again, you're going to have teams of people working on this migration project. Each team, actually, a lot of times each individual user, are going to have things that are important to them. This single project lead is going to need to be able to sift through all of those and line up the priorities in a way that allows the project to move forward as efficiently as possible. So that person is going to need to balance competing priorities among the different teams. This is going to avoid friction. Any friction that comes up in the project is going to cause delays and again, extend your overall project timeline. It's also important that this person is able to listen and hear the needs of the different team members. That's going to be important to keep morale high for the project, because these projects tend to go for a very long time. People can get discouraged, people can get frustrated, people can lose hope. It's important that this person is able to, again, balance those priorities, line them up in a way that everyone feels like their needs are being met or their needs will be met very soon. Having a single project lead also avoids miscommunications. You're going to be communicating probably many different channels. You may be using Teams chats, Slack channels, email, project management software, messaging. Maybe the vendor has a support desk that has a whole completely separate messaging system. The single project lead is going to be able to monitor all those channels and make sure that they have eyes on everything. I believe this single project lead needs to have a few qualities. First, this person needs to be organized. They're going to be dealing with a massive amount of information. They're going to need to be able to take in all that information, organize it in a way that helps everyone make sense and gets things done in an efficient manner. They're going to need to be articulate. They're going to be talking with many different people, maybe the vendor, maybe outside third parties, maybe customers. Certainly they're going to be talking with a lot of members of the organization. And most of all, they're going to need to be able to express and communicate things effectively and also in as few words as possible. Another quality is they're going to need to be an advocate. Again, there's going to be different competing interests, many different priorities from different users. This person needs to be able to hear those, needs to be able to make those people feel heard, and then be an advocate for them so that their interests are represented. Also, in the event that the vendor is going to be modifying the platform, a lot of times there will be vendor pushback when there are feature requests. So this person is going to need to be an advocate for the team when it comes to communication with the vendor. A fourth quality that I think is very important is that single project lead have some kind of domain and or technical knowledge. That's going to be a huge plus. There's a project I was working on where I had domain knowledge from working with that client for many years. But as a software developer, I also had the technical knowledge, and I was able to step in wherever there were gaps between what the vendor was able to supply and what the users needed. I was able to fill those in by writing some code. So that can be a huge plus when thinking about appointing a project lead. And I think most of all, you need to think of this as an investment in the success of the project. I would recommend not choosing someone who is an everyday user. The problem with that is they're going to have all of their regular day-to-day responsibilities, and then you're going to add in, oh, by the way, you need to lead this gigantic project as well. That's not going to go well. So I would recommend bringing someone in either from the outside or someone who is a special project lead for this particular project that doesn't have responsibilities outside of just managing this project. And the next lesson is I cannot stress enough the importance of building a team mentality. This migration project will take at least several months, if not several years, to complete. I've been on projects that have taken multiple years to complete the migration from beginning to end. That means you're going to be working together with each other for a long time. You're going to be maybe working with outside resources for a long time. You may be working with a software vendor for a long time. You need to think of all of you working together as a team. That's going to, again, keep morale high. That's going to keep people hopeful. There can be a lot of delays. There can be a lot of frustrations and a lot of stress during a project like this. Building a team mentality is going to pay dividends on this project. Now, something to keep in mind is that work is going to fall more heavily on some team members than on others. And the reason for that is, generally speaking, some people just have either more job responsibility or more expertise than others. Also, there's personality differences. Some people tend to be more go-getters. The problem can come when those people get completely overwhelmed. In this case, having a team mentality, other people can step in to help carry the burden for that one particular team member. The importance of feeling on the same team is this. There's a book called The Speed of Trust, and it talks about when there's trust, when there's that camaraderie, when there's that spirit of team, that is the quickest path to completion. Now, this applies not only to the team in your organization, but this applies to outside resources too. Having an adversarial mindset will slow your progress. Anytime where you feel like you're in opposition with anyone else working on this project, whether it's internal, whether it's external, that is going to slow your overall progress. And when you slow down your overall progress, that's going to cost your company money. As an example, I was working on a project where it got to the point where my client was relying on a vendor to modify their software so that they could move to this new platform. It was a very difficult migration. And at some point, the headbutting got so intense that they were about to scrap the entire project, even though they had been working on it for almost 2 years. What ended up happening was they called an emergency meeting where people flew in from all over the country to meet face-to-face in an office around a conference table to hash through their differences. I'm happy to say that the project continued on to a successful conclusion. However, what was fostered during that cross-country meeting was a spirit of teamwork. People realized that they had lost focus, that they were all working together, and that time ended up being a bonding time for everyone involved and allowed everyone to get back on the same page and move the project forward. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.